Hello. Thank you so much for that. Thank you, Sugi, for being here. And thank you all for coming to this session on Brotherless Nights. We've briefly heard about the book, but I'm going to expand on it a little bit. So the main protagonist of Brotherless Nights is Shashi. She's this very young woman living in northern Sri Lanka. She's a Tamil, and it's her. She aspires to be a medic, and the book chronicles what happens to her, what happens to her life. And I think the beauty of the book is that it shows the impact of conflict, right? I think we read the headlines, we read the newspaper stories, but this really is about the human side of what struggle does and how it impacts families in various ways. I'm going to start with a very obvious question because I think that kind of takes us into the crux of the novel in a way, is the title. So of course Sugi has 4 brothers and the novel tells us what happens to each of them. But I think more importantly than that, it tells us what happens to families and how suddenly women have to make choices which maybe previously they didn't have to make. And Sugi, of course, ends up being a medic, and she's working at the front line herself, and at a very young age before she's even finished medical school. So can you tell us a little bit about the title and about the families that are left behind, and then we can take that further.
Sure. Thank you so much, all of you, for coming, and thank you for being in conversation with me. Sashi is, she has 4 brothers, and the novel is very specifically, it's a feminist novel. It's a novel that is really about women, and so it is about the ways in which women labor and struggle through conflict in a civilian space. It's specifically about civilian women, really. And so Sashi has 4 brothers, Niranjan, Dayalan, Seelan, and Aaron, and they all have different sets of politics. They experience different fates. And Brotherless Night was not always the title of the book. It had many, many, many titles before that, some of which are now elsewhere in the book. But kind of at the last moment...
What was the first title?
It was called Fast, because there's a hunger strike in the book. And it had probably 6 or 7 other titles in there before that, after that. And then right at the end, before the book was going to production, my publisher said, your title that you have now is fine, but if you want to try to come up with a better one, you have this much time to do it. So there was a Google Doc and a lot of surveying of people and a lot of reading poems, and then really I went back to the book itself and I reread it 2 or 3 times before I found the phrase, which actually appears in the American edition across a page break, which maybe is why it took me so long to find. But it sort of metaphorically, it stands for one particular incident in the book, but it also kind of stands for, I think, for the whole war, the kind of loss of trust experienced by the community over so many decades.
It's so interesting that you mentioned one of the early titles was Fast, because I think this book, the seed of the book came to you when you were researching your previous novel, Love Marriage, and over there you came across a hunger strike. And of course the hunger strike plays a big role here, and one of the fighters does that. So can you talk a little bit about that strike and how that sort of became the seed of the story?
Sure. I was working on my first novel, which came out in 2008, and I was reading a book called The Broken Palmyra, which someone had handed to me when they had sort of learned that I was interested in reading about Sri Lanka. The Broken Palmyra is a book that is collectively authored by University Teachers for Human Rights, Jaffna, which was a collective of 4 Tamil professors at the University of Jaffna who were not trained in human rights documentation of any kind, but just were kind of self-taught. And they were interested in documenting what was happening to their community, and they did it really, really meticulously. And in that book, as well as in a couple of others, I found the story of this hunger strike, which took place in 1987 in northern Sri Lanka. And my imagination was really seized by this particular hunger strike, which was very theatrical, as far as I could tell. It was, a stage was built for it. It was at a temple, and the person who had gone on the hunger strike, I knew, was considered by many people to be a martyr, to be a saint. And the days of that fast are still commemorated in parts of Sri Lanka, and parts of the diaspora as well. So I was interested in how that story was told by different people, the different ways in which it could be imagined, because it seemed like it could be told so many ways. And it was such an unlikely incident. Even at the same time that this person was on his hunger strike, though, other people were on hunger strikes that were not as well documented, that were not as well known. I think simultaneously, an older woman was going on hunger strike nearby. So I was interested in why some acts of solidarity are elevated and others that are quieter are not. And I was interested in writing about the figure of that hunger striker, but not from his point of view. I tried that and then discovered I wasn't that interested in that. I wanted to watch. So I invented a point of view who would watch, and that became my narrator.
You talk about acts of solidarity, and I think one of the acts in this book, which is very powerful, is the coming together of the women, and especially when 360 boys are disappeared, and how all these women come together and they actually demand that their sons and their brothers return. And I think that's also a very important point in the novel, because for the first time, Shashi realizes that her mum is much more ferocious than she had ever imagined. And I think the father in this book is fairly absent, and the mother is the one who kind of, Shashi suddenly sees that this woman is never going to leave her son in the dark, and how she is going to do everything that she can. So I want to talk a little bit about those moments of solidarity, again, because it is the coming together of women and fighting for something as basic as knowing where your son is or knowing where your brother is.
Sure. So the incident that you're referring to, the Mothers Front March, took place basically after the army had requested essentially young men of a certain age to present themselves to be checked. And then essentially all of them were detained. So their mothers were furious and organized a massive march to demand their son's return, a march that would not have been successful if the numbers had been small. And so I think these days activism happens largely, I think, via cell phone, right? WhatsApp groups, signal chats, et cetera, et cetera. And these women organized across class and caste lines by going door to door and knocking and meeting people they had not met before. And someone who was involved in the march spent a bunch of time explaining to me how it had been organized and what had happened, which it seemed to me such an enormous amount of work that I kind of thought, how could you get that done? And then but what better motivation could you have than the return of your child? So to record that march in a fictional space was a great challenge. And I was also lucky to have access to people who had been there, and including someone who had been there as a daughter and who had kind of had an experience of seeing women elders acting with, as you describe it, for great ferocity.
This book has arisen from a lot of research, right? It's taken you decades to do. And it's interesting how you mentioned one of the mothers you've met. But in all your many, many interviews, is there one interview particularly that sticks in your mind? Or just, something that someone said which really took you aback?
That's such a good question. I talked to so many people. I think maybe I would mention, it wasn't exactly one interview, but there were a couple of people with whom I had kind of ongoing relationships where I would show them parts of the book and they would tell me what I had gotten wrong or how things had actually happened versus how I had imagined it. And there was one person in particular who I interviewed, but also there was one summer when I was working on the book in order, writing it in order, so I would send her a chapter every day, and she would read it immediately and call me up and tell me everything I had gotten wrong and everything I had gotten right. And then if I didn't send her a chapter the next day, she would call me and ask me where it was. And she was very generous in explaining her experiences and also just in correcting me when I had rendered something in a way that she felt was inaccurate. And so I had this sort of one-person Dickens experience. He was serializing it for newspapers. I was just serializing it for her. And she's a very particular person. And I was very lucky to have her both as a reader and as an informant.
I think Shashi, of course, she is a medic, and she's working at the front line in a Tamil hospital, essentially. But then she also becomes a chronicler. She starts writing and she starts documenting these experiences. And she has this really good quote, which I just want to read out. "I wanted it to be written down as I know it happened, Not the government's version and not the tiger's version, not the Indian version, ours. In a way, is that what you were also trying to do with this novel itself?
Sure, I think that's true, because I think that, the book is on some level a fictional homage to that nonfiction book that I mentioned earlier, The Broken Palmyra, which I think, was a chronicle kind of the communities. It was a community-sourced story, and it's really beautifully written. So I think that I wanted to put down a version that belonged to an ordinary person.
That's beautiful. I want to also ask you about the first line of the book. And I think if I have got this right, you've done many versions of this book, but I think the first line is actually as it was when you first wrote it, right? Like, I think 20 years ago.
It's very close.
Very close. And the first line is, I met the first terrorist I knew when he was deciding to become one. And I think especially at a time like this, a word like terrorist comes with so many connotations. And of course, you as a novelist, as a journalist, know that best. So can we talk a little bit about you framing that book from this opening line?
Sure. And before that line, even, there's a prologue, which also is kind of very argumentative and talks about the language of terrorism. And that prologue and the first line that you read from chapter 1 all were written in 2004, so very shortly after 9/11. But I, of course, had grown up in a community that had that word lobbed at us before that. So I was kind of watching people become familiar with that language, and I was already familiar with that language, already resented it, and was interested in the way it represented certain imbalances of power. Because to talk about terrorism is the language, the rhetoric of terrorism, the rhetoric of critiquing terrorism is largely state-built vocabulary. Which means that there's essentially no apparatus to talk about state-sponsored terror. And, those things are often existing in parallel with each other or overlapping in some way. And so to talk about one without talking about the other, without there being any language that has sort of similar valence, just seems really irresponsible. So in my nonfiction, for example, I never use that word. I always say militant or separatist or insurgent, but I won't generally use the word terrorist. And she is using it as a provocation. She's saying, I want you to pay attention to me, and I know that this will get you to pay attention to me. And also, just so you know, this word doesn't work. And by the time we get to the end of the book, you will know why it doesn't work. So she's a little contrarian.
Had you decided from the start that you would tell this in Shashi's voice? It's a very first-person voice, but was that a decision that was made early on itself, or was that something that you worked on and it changed over time?
Because I began writing about the hunger strike, she was the person who was watching the hunger strike. So it was always her, and she was always very clear, and she always had the same voice, which was convenient. And I don't have much conscious knowledge about how that happened. But it seems to have been a stroke of good fortune to have a narrator who was, in certain ways, very decisive.
It's also interesting how sometimes she addresses us directly. There's a you. The you comes in quite often, and there's a suddenly, like, you do feel implicated as a reader.
Oh, good.
I guess that was the intention. But can we talk a little bit about that? Because suddenly, you're reading a novel, but then she's also talking to you directly.
Sure. She always did that, and it happens even in the prologue. She says, you must understand. And she's really demanding, pleading, all of those different versions, hoping. And I think that I was interested in thinking about not only representation in terms of whom the characters were, but representation in terms of who the audience was. I had been asked after the publication of my first novel, which is set largely in the diaspora, who my audience was, and I was asked that all the time. And inevitably, it seemed to me that people who were asking that question wanted me to say it was them. And often it was, right? But I was interested in the ways that we ask a lot of questions about who the narrator is, but we don't necessarily interrogate the question of audience in the same way, thinking about, I wanted Sashi to think about who she was talking to, to think about her assumptions about who she was talking to. So there are various points where she assumes the reader as a figure somewhere in the West. There are other moments where she says, I should stop assuming that I know so much about you. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe you know exactly what I'm talking about, right? And that was also, I mean, I wrote the book for Sri Lankans, some of whom I knew would be in Sri Lanka and others of whom would be in the diaspora. And all of those versions of audience are people that she's talking to. And she's also, I think, trying to correct herself and trying to hold them to account as well, to be good readers. She wants them to be good readers of her story.
Right. Who is a good reader?
You?
Thank you.
I think a good reader is one who... I just think about how I grew up not really caring who the author was and just caring about the book before the availability of Wikipedia biography pages and so much paratext. I just wanted to read the story. And so I think she's really trying to create some kind of fidelity to the words on the page. She's being very intentional about the words she chooses. And she's hoping that you pay a kind of attention to those choices.
It's interesting how you've mentioned the diasporic audience and diasporic readers, and you've written very sort of poignantly about writing from the diaspora and how there is this sort of, people say that unless you've lived this, it's not an authentic recount, right? And I think that's so problematic because authenticity itself is such a slippery term, and you've really pushed back against that assumption that, unless you've lived it, it's not authentic. So can we talk a little bit about that, about sort of writing as a diasporic writer, but this is such a very authentic tale. And I mean, I don't really like that word, authentic, but still.
It would be great if we had a different term, but so far. I think a fair amount of the time, the United States doesn't have a huge Sri Lankan population. And on any given day, I'm the only person of Sri Lankan descent in a room, probably 95% of my day. And I could say anything about Sri Lanka and people would believe me. I could just go haywire. And it's a strange kind of power. I think that maybe business school folks call this something like first mover advantage. So, right, if you're a person in the world and you haven't been to a certain country and then you meet someone who either is from that country or descended from people from that country, they become your reference point for information and knowledge. Even if you've read books, even if you've studied, you think, well, this person knows about Greece, this person knows about France, and that's not what they said. And so you tend to just believe the first person you meet. So I didn't really like having that kind of power because it seemed unearned and a little, just really illogical as a way to understand the world. And yet, on the other hand, there are a lot of people who sort of think that diaspora shouldn't have anything to say about the homeland. And I think especially when a diaspora, is that word has its roots in forcefully displaced persons, right? If you have left the country because of a certain set of politics, you're going to continue to talk and think about those politics, and your children are going to inherit your knowledge about those politics and have their own opinions. And I don't think disenfranchising that set of people is realistic or ethical. So I was interested in balancing those kind of two poles, the people who thought I should have no authority versus the people who would give me too much. And what I really wanted was to think about what would make me think that I had authority, which it turned out to be research.
Do you think you could have written this book or even a similar book if you and your family were still living in Sri Lanka? Or do you think that distance actually proved beneficial, that you had that distance and you could actually maybe see things from a better perspective?
That's a great question. I think the book does start in New York in 2009, the year that the war ended. And that may or may not have been the case if I were in Sri Lanka. There are people doing incredible work documenting this kind of information who do live in Sri Lanka. So I'd like to think that I would try to behave following the incredible example that they've set. And I also have no idea if I would be capable of that.
It's interesting. I think, again, in this book, like you mentioned earlier as well, it's born from a lot of reportage, from speaking to people, from reading multiple sources, etc. I just want to read a few lines and then I'll ask you the question from that. As this so important person began speaking, the gunman lifted his weapon, considered his life, and fired. At least that is how I imagine it, as I have imagined so much violence in the years since I lived inside it. Am I imagining or am I remembering? I no longer know. When you were doing these interviews, were you often wondering that? Are these memories or is this imagination from the people you spoke to? And isn't there a fine line actually between that? Because so many of your characters have gone through horrible trauma, right? They've gone through things that no one should have to go. They've seen things happen to their families, which no one should have to see. So when you are talking to people like this, it also must be difficult to make them remember things that they might not want to talk about or they might actually want to forget. So can we talk about that line between imagining and remembering?
I think you're also partly asking about the ethics of research. What does it mean to ask other people about traumatic material? A fair number of the people I spoke to had not spoken very much about that period of their lives and were actually quite interested in doing so to a degree that sometimes really surprised me. And they were also very aware of the gap that you're referring to between sort of memory and imagining or just uncertainty. And also sometimes they remembered with total certainty incredible details. But I can think of moments where people remembered things differently, and then I would sort of think, which one do I do? So, for example, after the 1983 anti-Tamil pogroms in Colombo, people were traveling by ship from Colombo to Jaffna. So I was asking people, how long did this journey take? What was the ship like? And then I was finding written accounts from people who were saying this period of time, and someone else who was just telling me that wasn't right. And then I realized that she doesn't actually have to know. She doesn't have to have any idea. So it was generally possible to find a way to describe things that seemed honest to how she might have felt about them, at least. And when she's not sure about things, she's fairly honest about that as well. So that particular scene that you read the quote from, too, she's not present at that. It's something that's recounted to her. And she has a very slippery sense of it, and also a kind of community sense of it, a sense of it as a historical event, a sense of it as, she imagines that she has a connection to the gunman. She imagines what happens to him after he fires. So she has a sense of what she can grasp and also what might be a little bit out of reach.
I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about India, because India does feature in the book fairly prominently. And again, it's very movingly told about how there are these young men who are sort of literally swimming across and being trained in India and being armed with weapons and then coming back. And also, India has a proactive role at that time, but then there's also later in the novel, which is a really sad moment, when they're sort of waiting for the Indians to come and save them, and the Indians don't. And in fact, her mother is like, oh, the Indians will come, and Shashi is not so sure. So can we talk a little bit about writing that, and also maybe some of the research that went into it, and what kind of startled you about what you might have found?
Well, I knew that because I was writing a novel that was centered on women, I wasn't particularly interested in writing about what it was like for Khaddars in the Tigers to train in India, but I was interested in how you might feel if you were a sister who had been left behind by people who had gone to do such a thing. So I kind of wrote about it from that point of view, and it's well documented that people went to South India in particular and had training and support there, some of it state-sponsored. And it was also, right, it's also a place with which, right, many Sri Lankans have really warm associations with India, right? Will be referred to as Mother India. So there is this kind of warmth. And also, I think, in relation to certain aspects of the war, incredible anger. because Indian peacekeeping troops did come in 1987, and I grew up on stories of their atrocities, which were definitely something that I fully wrote about this period on purpose to put that in a book, because I felt that it was documented in the Broken Palmyra. There are certainly very common stories among members of the community, and the brutality is, it's just infamous. It's very common to hear people say the IPKF was worse than the Sri Lankan army. And that was really something that I wanted to put on paper, because people still talk about it. And that was, that was almost 40 years ago.
And I think that comes out very well in the book, because I think when Indira Gandhi dies, there is a sense of mourning, literally. But then there's also, like you mentioned, right, like the atrocities, and you write about that specifically. So there, there are these two emotions towards this force and towards this sort of foreign country.
Yeah, there's a moment in the book where, right, and of course this did happen, that when she dies, that Sri Lankan soldiers are mocking Tamil villagers, saying, oh, where is your savior now, essentially, right? And it was also a place of refuge for many displaced persons. There are people who left Sri Lanka after 1983, went to India, and never came back. So trying to depict those poles was really interesting and located in a lot of details that I didn't know before doing that research. For example, people being displaced to India and then coming here and sometimes finding themselves the objects of social censure, mockery, et cetera, as refugees, as people with, in some cases, different cultural values than people in the communities they had come to, particularly women, the difficulties of people who were students who had their educations interrupted in Sri Lanka and then came here and studied, and who have very fond associations with things like their schools here, their schoolmates. So all of this is, of course, all mixed together.
I want to ask you a little bit about, you mentioned, of course, the IPKF was worse than the Sri Lankan army. But I think it also comes out really well in the book about, and I think, of course, Shashi says it, she's like, this is the force that's supposed to be protecting us, and they're looking at the army, but we need protection from them. And I think that's what comes out so well in this novel, is just what happens to civilians. And I think you've said this in another interview where you were like, there's a Veterans Day, but there's no Civilians Day, and actually it's the civilians who pay such a high cost for it. So can we create, how did you create this so well? Or just, again, what did some of your research unearth?
Everyone I spoke to who condemned an armed actor, almost everyone, someone would always point out an example of an instance in which someone in that organization had behaved well. They would always talk about the instance in which someone had been extremely kind. And so I tried to depict these armed actors in ways that would hold them to account for the violence they had committed, while simultaneously acknowledging that organizations are not monoliths. Like the Indian Army the IPKF was not a monolith. There's a reference to a section where I think there are Indian soldiers who are doing demining, and a couple of them die, and the Tamil villagers mourn them. And then, but then also Tamil women become specifically afraid of the IPKF in terms of sexual violence. So putting both of those things on the page with all of the space of a novel, you can do that. And I think that if you choose the right details, you can get them to stick.
You started this novel, like you mentioned, back in 2004, and of course lots has changed since then. And I think, again, you mentioned how it was important for you to start from the beginning. So that's why this novel sort of opens in the 1980s. And I think because maybe there are more novels which talk about the end of the Civil War and all that happened. And again, I want to sort of ask you about that decision to go back to the start.
I'm not sure that I always knew that I would end up back at the beginning. I was very interested in the end of the war. I am interested in the end of the war. And then I think ultimately the question I had was how we had ended up there. What does it even mean to say we in that context? And I also was aware that there was a fair amount of literature that was about the run-up to the war, and then right at 1983. 1983 is sometimes depicted as a climax, and then the story stops. And the story doesn't necessarily go on. And so I thought about why that was. And then I thought it would be interesting to try. And some of it is that it's very politically complex. It's very violent. It's not a story with one good actor and one bad actor, which I think is maybe its primary challenge. And essentially, it's so complicated that it was an interesting kind of challenge to see if it could be done. And of course, there are other writers who have done it, some in Tamil, some in English, and so many different approaches. I was also interested in a kind of hyper-realism, partly because I knew many of the facts of this period were still contested. For example, early in the book, the Jaffna Public Library burns, and if you go and Google Jaffna Public Library burning responsible, you'll find a lot of different people arguing about who is responsible, although it is really not controversial and is pretty well documented. So I think of this as fake news before Americans got there. Sri Lankans had their own fake news about history, about canonical events. And so I wanted to put those facts on the page, those basic facts of who did some of these things. What were these experiences like? What did it really feel like? And then I also wanted to put things at the center that hadn't been at the center. And a lot of this literature comes out of Colombo for very good reason. And Colombo is, of course, a huge part of the story. But as a person my place in Sri Lanka is Jaffna. So I wanted to write a story that was set in Jaffna, where I think people had a very particular experience.
It's interesting how I think the grandmother returns to Colombo after a horrible incident happens to her, even though something bad happened to her in Colombo as well, right? And that's why she left. Were there many people you met like that who would sort of, went back to Colombo from Jaffna? And I feel there is this sort of to and fro movement happening, right? Because there's violence here, they go there, but it's not like they're necessarily safer there either.
I mean, one of the reasons she does that is I was just thinking about it and I realized, of course people went back. Some people went back. Maybe they lived in different houses or different neighborhoods. Maybe they tried to keep themselves safe in a different way, but some people did. And I mean, I don't think it was necessarily a lot of people, and I think it took time, et cetera. So, but I was curious to think about what would require someone emotionally to return to that place. But yeah, I mean, of course, now, and right, Shahan Kurunadilika writes about this in The Seven Moons of Malayalamida, that so much of that architecture is still there, right? The architecture of war is always around us. The conflict that has happened is still represented in the spaces, even when they're not marked, even when they're built over, not just in Colombo, but everywhere.
This book has taken you a while to write, and I think you've written about this, like in the Time magazine, etc., because of a physical injury where typing became difficult. And you write about it very movingly, about how suddenly you had to depend on others to write, which was something so fundamental to your identity, and how you had to read aloud versions and you had students helping you. So can we talk a little bit about that, about how suddenly reading your work to someone else who is essentially transcribing might have made it sound different, or what that process was like?
In the spring I had spent a lot of my childhood off and on having hand injuries, some of which were sports related and some of which were just sort of overuse. And then they were largely well managed. And then in the spring of 2021, partway through the pandemic, I ended up with a new set of injuries that also seemed to be from overuse. And so I had learned during a previous iteration of hand injuries kind of how to use voice recognition. And so I went back to that. I was using things like Google Documents, which has really good voice recognition, probably because it's mining your personal data. And I was writing with that. So there are chunks of the book that were revised or written in that way. And then I also work with access assistants who are supported by my university. And during the period of time that I was finishing the book, I was working with two really terrific access assistants, one of whom listened to me read the majority of the book aloud to them, and then also started to help me keep track of things like continuity, just kind of emotional logic, very specific word choice. So we did the proofs together. And I was lucky to have a person I trusted to do that with. And the students who work with me are really great. Because, by the time that student graduated, they knew if I was looking at a page when I wanted to scroll down before I would even say that. Zoom has a function called remote control. So that's what we use. The student gets remote control of my computer, and then I just talk to them. But in general, there's voice recognition software that's built into a lot of machines. It's very slow, and it will often take 2 or 3 voice commands to accomplish what could be accomplished in one click. So for an impatient person, it can be a challenge. But also, reading that whole book aloud required me to be really exacting about everything.
In terms of editing, does it make it simpler or more difficult? Or what is the editing process like then?
I think it actually made it really crystal clear, because you could hear when things were bad. And then you couldn't ignore it or skip it or avoid it or punt it to later. You would just have to do it right then. You'd be like, that's a bad sentence. Look at the grammar of that sentence. That sentence will eat you alive if you leave it in there. So to be able to talk through that was really, really helpful. And I think it's very common for creative writing teachers to tell their students to read their work aloud. I will say that I suspect it is also common that creative writing instructors are somewhat hypocritical about this, including me, which is to say I was often giving this advice before and I wasn't always following it. And in this case, I had no choice. And then I was like, oh, that really is good advice I've been giving. I should do it myself. So I'm glad to have had that discipline.
Has teaching writing been helpful to your own writing?
I have really wonderful, brilliant students, and they're very thoughtful and full of ideas about the ways that history and craft intersect, the different implications of storytelling choices, the politics of those choices. And they're creative and funny, and I think that it definitely helps my writing to be in conversation with them. And just to be in a community of writers where others are working and accomplishing so much, then you get to feel a little bit like part of a team, and otherwise it can feel very much like a solitary sport.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sugi. I want to leave enough time for questions, so we have about 10 minutes. Oh, wonderful. Someone right in the front.
Hi there. First of all, thank you for this incredible book. I read it last year and then sent a picture of the prologue to all the good readers that I know, Sri Lankan and non-Sri Lankan, because it was so amazing. I was born in the UK, but I have Sri Lankan heritage. And so for me, this book was actually difficult to read because the names were the people that I know, the food you described was the food that I know. And so I had to keep stopping and putting it down and taking breaks. So I'm really interested to understand what your experience was researching and writing and hearing all these stories firsthand, and whether you had a similar kind of emotional reaction and how you managed that during the process.
Thank you so much for that question and for the kind words about the book. I did take 20 years to write it, so I took some breaks. And I found other ways to make space for myself from the material. For example, I taught a humor class really specifically so I would read funny books while I was writing this one. And that was really helpful. And it put me in a classroom with students who also were in search of funny things. So that's just one example. And then I also I'm lucky to work kind of in communities of, because I'm in academia, I know a lot of scholars who are working on things within kind of area studies connected to Sri Lanka, anthropologists, musicologists, literature, scholars of literature. So, all of those people, historians, to be working in that community meant having a lot of support for exactly the kind of space that you're talking about, because others were just also having those reactions to the material that they were looking at. And often their material was informative for me. So to read other people's work, to look at other people's art that they were making in connection to this was incredibly helpful. And then I think I also just have, I had a lot of people cheering me on, which was nice, because at a certain point, if you take this long to write a book, people will stop believing that you're going to finish it. And you'll go to a party and people will be like, what are you working on? But they sort of have this look on their face like they're worried that they shouldn't be asking you, because it just becomes a very awkward social space. And I had a great conversation with my friend Sam Chang, who also teaches creative writing. And I said, Sam, I think, some people don't think I'm going to finish. And she said, well, are you? And I said, yeah. And she said, then it's fine. And I was like, oh, right, I don't actually have to worry about whether other people think I'm going to do it. I just have to do it. So to have a lot of people, like the person I referred to before, who would ask me for the next chapter, and she was someone who had lived through that period of time and had those experiences. So if all of those people could tell me about them, that was really good motivation.
The gentleman over there.
I'm a Jaffna Tamil. I grew up during the period that you write about. I'm sure you lived in Jaffna for a period. So what was the period that you lived in Jaffna?
I have not. Well, I guess it depends on how much time you would consider. I've been to Jaffna a lot. I think to describe it as living in Jaffna would probably be a mischaracterization. But I've spent a lot of time in Jaffna. I have a lot of family in Jaffna. And the period of time that I heard about most often as a child was this period of time. So, yeah, I think the periods of time that I spent in Jaffna, of course, were much later. I was not in Jaffna during that period of time. There were people who traveled from overseas to Jaffna during that period of time, but my family was not one of them. So a lot of my experience of moving through Jaffna was to ask, I heard this story as a child about this place. Can you show me the place? I read about this particular space. Can I see it? What does it look like now? So I had a lot of experiences of kind of now and then. And I don't know, I've never really added up all of my time in Jaffna to know how much time it has been. But it's the place that I always want to go. And I think it's the place that part of my brain lives.
Thank you. I thought I saw a third hand. Yeah.
Hi. So my question is, one thing that really stood out to me when I read the book was the part at the very end when Sashi begins documenting the human rights violations. And I was curious if that was based on real reports, and if so, what do you think is the significance of keeping a record of a lot of these abuses?
Sashi's documentation of human rights violations, which she does in collaboration with others, are based on the reports produced by university teachers for Human Rights Jaffna. The reports that appear in my novel are generally, they have sometimes different subjects than the ones that UTHRJ was producing. What do I think is the point of documenting like that? At one point during my research, I heard someone speak who was talking about the value of documentation towards kind of the long arc of justice. And that meant something to me. That was a helpful thing to hear, because that person was facing a question, sort of asking, what is the point of your work? And that was their reply. And they were convinced of the value of what they were doing, that justice might not be immediately forthcoming but that there was some sort of longue durée that could be supported by meticulousness in the present. So I think that we're also living in a moment where many of our relationships to time are changing, which is something I'm really curious about. Some of that is because we imagine the future differently. I think when I was younger, I used to imagine the future as something that was definitely coming, and now I'm less sure about that. And I think there's so many different factors, climate change, rising fascism, et cetera. And so I'm not sure that I'm still thinking about that longue durée in quite the same way, but it's still something that sort of documentation works towards. It's a kind of optimism, a steady, relentless optimism that I can believe in.
Thank you. I think I saw someone else at the back. Yes. Please hold it closer.
Hi, I was curious why you chose to write this as fiction rather than non-fiction, given that you did so much research and you yourself said you wanted certain facts spoken out or brought to light. So, yeah, why the fiction medium? What made you choose that?
There are a lot of people who have written really excellent nonfiction about Sri Lanka, so that was something I knew. And also, I just think I'm better as a fiction writer. I'm just better at it. So picking the thing that I was the best at for the material that I cared about the most made a kind of sense. I think I was also aware of the ways in which I was using many of the skills I had honed as a nonfiction writer, interviewing, for example, for this purpose. And also, I subjected this book to various processes of fact-checking, but they were not the same processes that I would have followed if it were nonfiction. So the bar that something had to meet to get in the book was pretty high, but it was my bar. It wasn't two sources right? And it also meant offering, in some cases, to people who were speaking to me, a kind of safety that I couldn't have offered as a nonfiction writer necessarily, right? I can transform things in a way that as a nonfiction writer, I wouldn't. I was, as a nonfiction writer, raised in a newsroom, which means I don't create composite figures. I don't get fuzzy with memory. I really, as a nonfiction writer, will write exactly what I know. So in the space of fiction, if I heard a story, I could invent a story in a space adjacent to the story that had actually occurred, and thereby represent that truth without exactly carving it in with the same details. So I think that allowed certain kinds of knowledge that were present in the community for me to put those on the page. Whereas in a nonfiction book, I might not have been able to do that. And at least to me personally, that was really satisfying.
Thank you so much. We have 1 more minute. So, anyone else? Someone here. Sorry, I can't see. The lights are there. Yes. Yeah.
Over there?
Why did it take you so long to write such a good book? And also, did the people you interview not get tired of waiting for such a long time?
I'm sure some of them did. I think sometimes I just, I didn't have an outline or anything at the beginning. I wasn't totally sure what the book was about or what its shape was. And then it was very difficult material, and sometimes I was probably being emotionally avoidant or had too much work in other spaces. During the period of time that I worked on this book, I was a student at 2 institutions and I think taught at 4 and had fellowships at a bunch of different places. So I lived a lot of different lives in that span of time, and many of them were completely absorbing in their own right. So, and all of them, I think, in the end, informed the book as well. So I can't say that I'm glad I took that long. I can't say that I think that I'll probably try to be faster next time. But that was what happened, and I think that without that length of time, it would have been a different book.
Thank you so much. The book is available in the bookshop, so do please pick up a copy. And thank you, Sugi, for writing a truly momentous novel.
Thank you so much for such a great conversation. Thank
and
you so much for coming.
JLF.